This episode is going to cover the last chapter in the first unit. It's going to be the final chapter dedicated to the structural frame. It's called Organizing Groups and Teams, and as you can easily imagine, it's going to be a lens into understanding the structural frame that deals primarily with the way that groups and teams are organized within an organization to try to give everyone who is a member of a team a role. We're going to look at the power of teams. Now, whenever you think about teams, your mind might jump immediately to athletics, but it's not simply in a matter of finding athletic teams and understanding them as the only route to organizational teamwork. You can also think about from a medical profession. There are teams that work for surgery. There's an anesthesiologist who preps you for surgery and is the person who puts you under. If they were to give you too much anesthesia, you could die long before the life-saving procedure ever took place. There's people who do the initial cutting and general surgeons who are able to help put you in a position to have the specialist come in and, say, perform a heart surgery, perform a brain surgery. You have people who are specific to a role. A brain surgeon might know nothing about the heart, even though they know everything about the brain, and vice versa. What that proves is that people are given specific roles within teams that they need to perform their task, but they don't need to know everyone's role, and together they can form a life-saving whole. Now, there's also small, much smaller in terms of goal-related teams, where you don't hold the power of life and death in your hand. Every time you as a boy or Girl Scout had a fundraiser to try to go out onto a field trip of some sort, you all worked in selling goods or getting donations or getting money from sponsors to run some kind of distance to work towards getting money for that field trip, but you had an achievable goal in mind. If you reached that threshold and everybody in your troop or group was able to go on that trip, then you were successful. Now, you might not have saved a life that day, but the same methodology applies. From a structural frame perspective, a team or a group is successful when they are able to utilize the roles that are given to the members of the team to achieve the goal in question. Therefore, top performing teams need the right blueprint of roles and relationships within a group in order to make people be able to be optimized to make the right choices. So when we're talking about organizing groups and teams, we're going to talk about a series of things. We're going to talk about teams and the linkages between them. We're going to talk about interdependence. We're going to talk about the determinants of successful teamwork. And we're also going to talk a lot about structure. For me, since it really is highlighting what the structural frame is all about, how things are organized, how things fit together, we're going to spend a good amount of time highlighting that section of the chapter, which I think is very fertile with important information and interesting ground to cover. So, talking about tasks and linkages in small group, there are variables that go into the structure of any given team. What's your goal? What needs to be done? Who should do what? How should we make decisions? And so on and so forth. So, take for example, we'll go back to the original analogy that we were using and use the avenue of athletics. You can look at a football game in its most simplistic form and say the goal of a football game is for one team to score more points than the other team to achieve victory. Sure, that might be the goal, but what needs to be done gives you a bunch of different variables that you can imagine. Are we going to pass? Are we going to run the ball? That has completely different variables in terms of the strength of your offensive line or their ability to pass, protect versus play run offense. Also, think about the possibility of defense. Are we going to try to play really tough defense, keep it to being a low scoring game? Or are we going to sometimes give up big plays on defense under the assumption that we play a high powered, fast paced offense and we're going to try to outscore the opponent? These are different methods of achieving the same goal. Both ways you'll come to I've scored more points than you, but the variables and the ways in which you get that accomplished are radically different. The roles that people need to achieve those goals are radically different. And it's not just that. Think about, instead of athleticism, whenever we're dealing with something even as simple as going back to, from our English days, Lord of the Flies. How do we make decisions? If you can imagine the boys after the crash and they're on the island, if I asked you who speaks, if you read the book, he who holds the conch speaks. They needed rules to establish who could speak and when, how they were going to make decisions. Are we going to look for consensus? Are we going to look for a majority rules kind of decision-making process? Are we going to anoint one leader to make the choices for us and follow his or her direction? Who's in charge? Do we get a vote in that? Are they in charge because they are the child of the person who was formerly in charge? All these things, in terms of the way that small groups function and groups within an organization work, are all based on variables that can make a team stronger or weaker. So when we're continuing to talk about situational variables, there's variations of time, quality, and participation. Some people's identity is deeply ingrained in a group. If I asked you what you do, or what matters to you, or I asked you, tell me something about yourself. If you told me that you're a musician, and that was the first thing you told me about yourself, it's very likely that music plays an integral role to your identity and who you are and what matters to you. Maybe you grew up in a household where your parents might be music instructors, where they might play more than one instrument. You are dedicated to a particular instrument or instruments, or perhaps vocal. Either way, the music that you perform or the contribution to music that you make is really, really important to you. So that's what I talk about whenever I say both quality and participation. This means a lot to you. It's also required a great deal of time. Some small groups are only together until they achieve a very small goal. So small groups in a corporate world are easy to imagine because they might be a sales team of sorts. We've all, who have worked in retail, had group sales where one side of the store is going to compete with the other side of the store, and we're going to see who can sell more of the things that are in question. If you think about movies, or you think about television dramas, there's constantly a camaraderie among salesmen and saleswomen, but there's also a competitive edge towards them. So the small group, in a sales sense, comes together for the time period of the sale to work together, but they still, in terms of participation, have some individual tendency, some desire, some push, some pull. All teams come with the quality of wanting to be a shining star within them. Even within the structural perspective, you have to understand that for every role that you give a person, they want the team to do well, but they also want their individual merits to show through. In a corporate environment, there's only going to be one person who gets the raise. There's only going to be one person who gets to move up the corporate ladder, so to speak. In a athletic situation, there's only going to be one starter. There's only going to be one person who makes the most money on the team in a professional setting. There's always going to be competition for scarce resources, even within the structural frame. It doesn't exclude those ideas. So whenever you're thinking about how to attribute the way we arrange our team, we might look at what are the special skills and talents of the group members, what are the relationships, and how do we determine success? Depending upon who you have on your group or who you have on your team, and anybody who has gone back to their elementary school days and played a game of kickball where we go back and forth and the two teams pick, all the way down to that sad last person to be selected. That team is trying to achieve a goal, and you can look and size up the two teams on each side. Who are the best players? Who are the weakest players? What can they do? Are they glaringly weak in one potential way? That's the same thing that happens whenever you're making specialized teams within organizations. It's an opportunity for the relationship between group members and the task and the chore at hand to be able to be what guides you to the way that they're arranged. Go back to that original sporting analogy I used with football and extend that metaphor here. If you have a really good quarterback, you're going to try to pass more often. If you have a spectacular running back, you're going to run the ball more often. Now, I use that as an obvious analogy, hopefully, one, for people who don't follow sports, but two, because it makes clear you build your team around someone with a special skill set that lets you do something that could slight the odds in your favor in terms of a goal when your goal is a competitive one. So let's talk about some different ways to arrange a team. Maybe based on people's special skill sets, maybe based on what's available, but we're going to look at three primary ways to structure small groups. And these are very basic structural configurations, but it's the idea in the first one of one boss. When you have one boss, it goes all the way back to chapter 3 when we talked about vertical coordination. It's got a certain dictatorial element to it. There is one leader, one ruler, one boss. They make the decisions, and that team thrives on the success of that person, and they're going to be the one who takes the blame if this group fails. They're going to be the one that takes the lion's share of the success if that team succeeds. You can look at this as a player or a coach in an athletic environment. You might look at this as the manager or the store owner. If you're looking at it from a corporate environment, you might look at it as the surgeon, if we talked about extending the medical analogy that we had. If somebody, let's hope this doesn't happen, but in terms of understanding the analogy, if somebody dies during surgery, the person who comes to tell the loved ones is typically the one who was working on that specific body part. So say it was a brain surgeon, say it was a heart surgeon. They're the one who comes to explain what happened, apologize, give the bad news, and let the family mourn accordingly. They don't send out the person who scrubbed them in. They don't send out the anesthesiologist. Those people played important roles, but they're not the one boss of this particular environment. They're not Tom Brady for the New England Patriots. They're not the one who gets a lot of the glory, whether it is truly fair or unfair. That's what a one boss structure provides. It requires that the person who's in that role has a certain special set of skills that allow them to put other people in better positions. If you've ever had a leader of a team or a leader of a group who you might consider a natural born leader, somebody who by the nature of who they are is very successful at making sure that other people get to do what they can do best, brings out the best in other people, really connects with the other people on a team, is a leader not because somebody said, hey, that's the leader and that person is wearing a C on their jersey. No, they're the leader because they do the best. They're the person we admire. They're the person that we want to follow. That's what the one boss configuration really allots for. Now, dual authority is interesting because dual authority follows the mindset that we have two poles, if you want to think about it, two primary access points for where authority is derived. And though it comes to a point in terms of a pyramid, each side has the ability to influence the success or failure of the other. I'm sorry for anybody who is not a big sports fan, but because of the nature of teams and small groups and the way that it's both discussed in the chapter and the analogies that we use, we have to keep extending more sporting analogies. But I'll give you another very simplistic one that anyone can relate to. staying with football, there's an offensive captain and a defensive captain. So there's two different authorities on each side of the ball. If one side is failing, say the offense isn't scoring enough points or the defense is allowing the other team to score too many points, then that affects both sides. They can't be successful without both doing not only their part, but achieving at a very high level. Taking it into a corporate world, if you're producing widgets and the other side of your business is selling widgets, if there is one part of a dual authority that is selling far more than you're producing, then you need to bring that into equilibrium. However, if you're mass producing widgets and they're not selling them, then you have an inequity that you also have to try to reconcile. That kind of dual authority within a small group or within an organization shows how each side is interdependent upon one another in order to succeed. There's also simple hierarchy. Simple hierarchy is interesting because it follows that model that Mintzberg covered whenever you talk about the middle management aspect. We use the analogy often someone's right arm or their second in command, and that would be represented by the image here whenever you talk about a simple hierarchy. There's somebody who is the leader of your group, but then there's also somebody who is a lieutenant at arms, somebody necessary to help make things go forward, somebody that the rank and file members still answer to, but is not officially the person who is in charge. It's that second in command mentality, that lieutenant, that Mr. Smithers to Mr. Burns analogy, if you want to use it. They do in popular culture, a typical trope is the sycophant who is in love with the leader, is a follower, is a diehard, will fall on their sword for that person, but also could not lead themselves, does not even consider themselves a possible threat to that job. They want to be the support system. Most teams thrive under that. The problem that I think that we like to put whenever we fall into the fallacy of blaming people, we also fall into the fallacy in an inverted way of attributing too much value to a leader. A lot of times it's not necessarily the team that has the best leader that wins. It's the team that has that best secondary level that really wins. People who have bought into the leader's perspective. Somebody who can make sure that the leader's edicts are followed. Somebody who is your John the Baptist and no other analogy to extend it to a religious metaphor. You need somebody who is out there being your verbal champion, who is fighting on your behalf and championing your cause, making others look up to you, making others see the light in some capacity as to how you lead. And I think that's what the strength of a simple hierarchy is in terms of small group linkages, working towards a task. When you have that and you're working towards a long-term or a complicated goal, that's whenever simple hierarchies really truly shine. So we've talked a lot about teamwork and interdependence in different sports. I don't think I need to belabor this point anymore. It feels like at this point I would just be further alienating anybody who didn't work with sports. But just so it's not all football related, let me also say that if you think about baseball, you can understand that for every single time you've got a great hitter who is scoring you runs and running up the scoreboard, you also have to have pitching on your side. So offense and defense in order to make sure that your team is not lopsided. Because no matter how great one, two, or even three of your hitters is, there's only so many men in that rotation or women in a softball game. And inversely, their pitchers are going to need to step up. They're going to need to be able to protect that lead, or else you're going to fall apart without that interdependence as well. So we want to look at the determinants of what successful teamwork looks like. You say, okay, I've bought into everything that you say. I understand from a structural perspective how teams can be fit around roles and how the goals of a team would manipulate those roles and would manufacture a structure that's built for that kind of success. So, what does a successful team look like? How do we determine that potential success? The primary ways that we talk about this are the degree of task interaction, the distribution of team members, the autonomy needed given the team's goals and objectives, and the task of management. So let's talk first about the nature and degree of task interaction. How much do we really need to work together? We've all been a member of a small group in a classroom where one person wanted to have a meeting about every little thing. Our goal is to create a 20-minute PowerPoint. We don't need 6 meetings in order to prepare for that 20-minute PowerPoint. We need a meeting where we get together and we discuss what everyone's going to do. During the interim time between meetings, we need all of the group members to do their research, to put together their number of PowerPoint slides. Then we need to reconvene for a second meeting, put together that PowerPoint, discuss what everyone's going to say, do a practice run where we allocate time. And those 2 meetings should comprise everything that we need in order to be successful. So the degree of task interaction is really meaningful whenever you think about the goal that you're trying to achieve. You also have to deal with the geographical distribution of members. We're in an online class. Let's use this as an example. So we're a small group of sorts. We're a small group, though not necessarily an organization, but we're a small group. And whenever you're talking about a general teamwork atmosphere, I toyed with the idea of having everyone give a speech, recording themselves and then uploading it to either YouTube, making it available to us, or uploading it directly to the Angel site. But I thought that because of the geographical distribution of members and the potential technological difficulties that put forward, that I didn't think that it was worth it. I thought that the discussion boards would be a better way for us to interact. That's because I thought that the technology and distribution of members, so that we couldn't all be in the same place at the same time and witness the same speeches, would be an impediment that would prevent successful teamwork for us as a group in a learning and educational environment. There's also one other thing that I want to touch base on here, and that's where is autonomy needed given the team's objectives and goals. That's where that idea that I touched on earlier with your opportunity to shine even within a team, to get your individual accolades, to get your numbers, so to speak, or to get your recognition for your own contribution. It's every time that you've been a member of a team, but you've still received an individual accolade. So I remember using an analogy from elementary school that I tried with a Boy or Girl Scout troop. We went in the 3rd grade on a close-up trip, they called it, to go to Washington, D.C. And in order to go to Washington, D.C., we needed to sell candy to pay for part of the trip. We were going to pool all the money that we'd got from our individual sales to a group fund to see if we could purchase the ticket to be able to go, or subsidize the ticket in some way. We achieved our goal and beyond and had some extra money, but I won an award for having been the top salesperson in my class. So I received an individual award, nothing more than a printed little award that somebody had made, in Microsoft Office, I'm sure, or publisher. But that was an individual accolade for a group accomplishment that allowed me to feel like I had achieved success for myself, even within the larger group context. We all played the same role as salespeople. We all went to our established, neighborhoods, went to our parents' jobs. We sold with what little skill we had as 3rd graders, but you were also able to shine individually too. So there was an individual component. And so you still need to have some kind of autonomy, some kind of personal latitude to make decisions as to how you want to do them, and to be able to shine within yourself even within a teamwork atmosphere. So when you're thinking about team structure and top performance, there are 6 distinguishing characteristics of high functioning teams, and that is that they shape their purpose in response to the demand or the opportunity that's in front of them. They have specific measurable goals. They have a manageable size. They have the right mix of expertise. They have a common commitment, and they are collectively accountable. I'll go through these each individually, but relatively quick. Whenever you shape the purpose in response to the demand or opportunity, what they mean by that is a lot of what I talked about in the first section of this chapter and previously in chapter 3, whenever we talked about they orient themselves in regard to the goal that they have set for themselves. Winning a championship, achieving a sales goal, keeping somebody alive during the heart transplant. Any number of goals shape their purpose, and they find ways to respond to this opportunity or demand that's placed upon them. They have specific measurable goals. Did we succeed or did we fail? It's important to have long-term big goals, and it's important to have existential goals, but you want to have measurable goals, a dollar amount, a number of things sold, a number of games won, a number of points scored. You want to be able to keep score when you're talking about a team in some capacity. You want to know that you did well. You want a measurable goal. You want to know that you succeeded. A correct amount of pounds of food donated, of number of clothing items given to charity. However you measure your goal, you want to be able to have specific enough goals that they're tangible, touchable, smellable, that you know that they're there. You need to make sure that your team has a manageable size. Once a team gets too big and too large, they go from a team to a public of sorts. It's that difference between a small group communicative event or a public communicative event. It becomes hard to organize, hard to standardize, hard to see how you're all interdependent. You just become a bunch of people who are doing a job, and it's much less collective. You need that size to be manageable. Now, that size might be relatively large. It's not that it needs to be a small, intimate group, but it needs to be defined enough that you're all working towards the same purpose. Take, for example, belaboring the point, but so that we're clear, there are 52 members of a professional football team at any given roster, but those 52 people are the manageable size that you're able to work with. There might only be 5 people in your particular Boy or Girl Scout troop, but that's the manageable size of that troop. See how each one might be, 10 times more than the other one, but at the same time, it's a manageable size for the task, for that purpose that we're talking about. You need the right mix of expertise. You need to make sure that you have someone who is capable of leading and someone who is bringing special skill sets to the table. Now, it might be different in every team, and you might reorient yourself based on the abilities that you have and change the way that you approach the goal, but that mix of expertise is incredibly important. You need a common commitment. This does not mean that everyone needs to be intensely committed. No. It just means that everybody has to share the same level of commitment. You don't have some people that live, die, eat, breathe this particular activity, and some people who are just casually kind of committed, show up some Wednesdays, sometimes they skip. You need people who are all equally committed to the cause, and that is a functioning determinant of a really strong team. Finally, you need to be collectively accountable. You need to make sure that commitment is when it's tested, that you hold each other collectively accountable. I think weight loss groups are the best way of understanding collective accountability. High functioning weight loss groups are people who say, hey, and we'll call each other, did you work out today? Have you been staying on the straight and narrow in terms of eating? People who are trying to contribute to one another's personal betterment and self-help groups are a way of understanding personal accountability through that kind of team-related structure. There's an us to those kinds of groups. So in conclusion, what did we talk about today? We talked about how teamwork works. We talked about the structure of teams. We talked about determinants of high functioning teams. We really did a lot of work to better understand the roles, responsibilities, structure, and goal orientation of teams from a structural perspective. If I were writing a response paper about this chapter, some of the topics that I might talk about were: what are the determinants of high functioning teams and have I been on one? Were the high functioning teams that I was on congruent with those determining factors? How, or if not, why not? Were there things that they missed? Are there things that you believe that are required for strong teamwork that just weren't covered in the chapter? Is there a structure to a team that you see or a group within an organization that you believe is very high functioning that's not listed in the book? There were two other kinds of group formations that I intentionally left out after simple hierarchy that are in the book. Either one would provide an interesting way to orient a response paper around, because I think they're a little bit more complicated than the hierarchy, dual authority, or singular authority that we looked at. And finally, one last response paper that I think I would organize an idea around is when we go back to the very beginning and we talk about what responsibilities does somebody potentially have within a team. Use a case study example. Talk to me about how a team you were on divided its roles, created group norms, who held the conch, so to speak, who talked, who was the leader, how'd they get to be the leader. Delve in with personal experience to what these chapters could mean for you, and I think that's always a good response paper. As always, I hope that you not only enjoyed this lecture, but if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me via email, and I'll be speaking to you again soon. Coming up next is going to be the human resources frame, so we'll be switching up frames and moving into the next unit. I look forward to talking to you then.